Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'll be giving you all the final update on the 2024 Senate map. This will be the penultimate prediction, the most important Senate video that I'm going to make for the next, really 2 years. So with that being said, we all know how important this is. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment down your prediction right now before you see mine. Now let's talk about this Senate map. Democrats starting out at 28, Republicans with an advantage starting out at 38, because obviously there are more Democratic seats up for election this year, so Democrats have more territory to defend. This is going to be an interesting map. We've got a lot of states that have shifted into the competitive column in the final months of this campaign. So, again, let's get into it. We're going to begin, as we always do, by filling out the states that are going to be safe for the Democratic Senate candidates. I am including Minnesota in this list at the lower end of it. Certainly in terms of margin, but it's not really worth talking about because Democrats are likely to win here by around 15. And I'm also going to be including Vermont and Maine, which are technically going to be won by independents, but are functionally Democratic. The one safe Democratic state that I do want to talk about is Maryland, which I'm moving back into the safe Democratic column after I had it out for a couple of months here. Larry Hogan, if we take a look at his polling, started out well, but since then hasn't really been performing all that well. And the issue that this race brings to mind is that Hogan can certainly get to 42% of the vote. He's at 42, 40, 43, 40, 43. So he's in that low 40s range. But can he get more than that? I don't think so. And again, because I do think we have evidence that polls in general are going to slightly underestimate Democrats in some of these safer states, not the swing states, but maybe in the safer states, right? That is enough for me to put this race in the safe column. Hogan was a popular former governor, but also Brooks has kind of run away with this in the final I'd say weeks of this campaign as undecided voters in a deeply blue state who are going to be voting for Harris are going to come home for Democrats down the ticket. I think Hogan's going to finish with around 40% of the vote when it's all said and done, and he's going to underperform his polls. And we usually see this, right? Popular governors in states that go the other way, they start out strong, but they can't crack 40 or 45% in the polls, and they end up underperforming on election day. We saw that with Steve Bullock in 2020 in Montana. We saw it with Phil Bredesen in 2018 in Tennessee. This year, I think we're going to see it with Larry Hogan in Maryland. So Democrats at 41, but Republicans, obviously, we've got to give them their safe seats. And these are going to be, kind of what you'd expect. I don't have any seat I want to talk about. But I do have a few likely Republican seats I want to talk about. So we're actually going to kind of snake this a little bit. We're going to go to the likely Republican states first before we get into the likely Democratic states, because I think the likely Republican states are pretty close to safe. At least some of these, actually, we're kind of going to move around here. But we'll start in Missouri, which I think is the easy state to get off the board at this point. Missouri, state that Donald Trump will likely win by 15 to 17 points. But Republicans in that Senate race, a bit worse. Josh Hawley is the GOP incumbent here, and he won by 6 points in 2018 against Claire McCaskill, a two-term Democratic incumbent. So Hawley has won competitive races before. The good news for him is that this year it will not be competitive, but I do think he's going to underperform Trump. Why? Because that's usually what happens. Hawley is a very Trumpian Republican, and what we've seen is that Trumpian Republicans, not named Donald Trump, do not do well. Look at Kari Lake in Arizona. That could be relevant later in this video even. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But in 2022, we saw this with Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, right? Trumpism can be popular. It can work. Trump won the 2016 election. He may very well win tomorrow, but the candidates who try to replicate it, Mastriano, Hawley, Lake, they don't do as well. Hawley won't lose the Senate race, but mark my words, he will underperform Trump by at least a couple of points. And for that reason, I wanted to acknowledge that and put it in likely. Let's now go to our two Democratic states that are going to be likely, which are going to be New Mexico and Virginia. Now, New Mexico and Virginia obviously should not be too competitive, but New Mexico, I do want to note, if you're thinking about margin here, this one could be a little closer than Democrats would like it to be. Martin Heinrich is the incumbent here. In 2018, he won convincingly. I mean, there was a third-party candidate in this race, Gary Johnson, who got 15% of the vote, but in the two-party share, Heinrich won by 24. So he's certainly a candidate that Democrats have, liked in New Mexico, but his polling, he's not doing all that well. He got a lot of undecided voters, not very well known in New Mexico, given, considering he's an incumbent senator. So I think he might actually struggle a little bit. And I think he's going to win by less than 10 points. So could be a little closer than people think, but I don't think Republicans have a real chance of picking this seat up. Now, Virginia, this seat's gotten a bit of attention in recent days because we got a poll, I believe, from Kism that had a close race here with Hung Kao only 2 points behind Tim Kaine. But every other poll shows that Tim Kaine's doing very well. I think he's going to win by 11 or 12. Again, in 2018, he did very well. He won by 16 points, and it could be a bit closer this year, but realistically, he's not at risk of losing, similarly to Josh Hawley. I just want to acknowledge the margin. Let's now go to our likely Republican states. I'm going to give you two more. The first is going to be Florida. Now, Florida is a state where Democrats have been getting excited in the past week. And what we generally know, general rule of thumb, is that Democrats should not get excited about Florida because it never ends well for them. And all, jokes about Florida aside, I think when you do the actual analysis, that is also upheld. Let's take a look at the polling data. That's where we're going to start. In this state, we know that Democrats have historically been overestimated by polls, but this year it looks bad for them already. Morning Consult is the best poll Democrats have gotten in the past month. They still Rick Scott up by 3. Stetson University has him up by 8. Signal, GOP-aligned firm, has him up by 4, which isn't actually that great, but it's still another data point. FAU had Scott up by 4. St. Pete polls, which is historically a poll that underestimates Republicans significantly, they still have Scott up by 3. Emerson has Scott up by 6. And then obviously we did get an RMG poll that had Scott up by 8. Marist is another good pollster I like, and they only had Scott up by 2. I think that's a concern. But the best poll that's done this race by far is New York Times Siena, and they have Scott up by 9. I'm going to pick Scott to win by, I think, 6 or 7. I think maybe a little more than that. My belief is that, and again, this is what we've, I think what we've kind of been seeing, is that Democrats have closed the gap late in early voting, but it's still not enough. It's still significantly worse for them than 2020, and Republicans are going to turn out on Election Day, as they did in 2022, to really just make this a blowout. Obviously, I don't think that Debbie Merkel-Powell is going to lose by as much as Val Demings did in 2022. I also don't think it's going to be very close. Florida, to me, is still likely Republican. I know a lot of Democrats are getting excited about this race, and the early voting has gotten better for Democrats in the past few days. I acknowledge that. I still don't think it's going to be close, especially because Florida independent voters are going to swing towards the Republicans this year, as they did in 2022. So the final likely Republican seat, though, is a lot more interesting. It's Nebraska. Now, just in general, I feel like it's kind of worth talking about this race, broadly, because if you've been out of the loop, you might be thinking, well, why is Nebraska even on the board? Nebraska, interestingly, has been very close in the polls, and it's pretty simple why. It's because Democrats didn't run a candidate. An independent candidate named Dan Osborne is running against Deb Fischer, who's the GOP incumbent here. Again, Deb Fischer obviously won in 2018 pretty decisively against a Democrat. This wasn't like a real race. But again, what we saw is, and what we've been seeing is that independent candidates in these states that tend to go the other way, they do well. Dan Osborne has run actually a pretty right-wing campaign. He's actually compared Deb Fischer to Democratic politicians like Hillary Clinton. He's accused her of not, being firm enough to Trump. It's an interesting strategy because he's essentially attacking her the way a Republican would attack a Democrat. And so, it kind of comes down to whether or not Nebraskan voters, who by and large will vote for Trump, do they buy it? And I would say no. There's no real reason for, if you're a Republican in Nebraska, to vote for an independent. Certainly some people in Nebraska, obviously, I think Osborne's going to significantly outperform Kamala Harris because there are going to be some Republicans who are going to vote for him because he's an independent. But at the same time, historically, we've seen independents do well in the polls. Then on Election Day, they kind of fold because undecided voters break against them. And in the polls that we have that are nonpartisan, like the most recent YouGov poll, Fischer was up by 7. I think that's kind of an accurate reflection of where the race is at this point. Osborne's going to do really well. Again, Nebraska is a red state, and the fact that it's even close is impressive, but I really just don't believe the polls that he's been releasing that have him tied. And we did see the New York Times actually, this is shocking that they came out and said that this was actually a close race, but again, to me, I'm not going to bet on the independent here when historically independents do underperform. With that being said, we've got a competitive map here now. We've got 8 seats that are going to be under 5% per my forecast. Let's get into it with the lean Democratic states. The first is going to be Nevada, which is actually moving down from likely, I believe, at least in my last forecast. And this is mostly because we've actually seen movement towards Sam Brown, the Republican candidate here. Jackie Rosen still has a pretty significant polling lead of 6%, but it's down from her 10-point polling lead that we saw earlier. Sam Brown's kind of, I think, coalesced the GOP base. He's winning over the undecided voters who are going to vote for Trump. Now, the good news for Rosen is that the good pollsters have this race as a pretty clear victory for her. New York Times Siena has her up by 9. Emerson has her up by 4. What we did see was interesting was that Susquehanna was the first poll to show Brown ahead, but only by 1%. It was a small sample size, and Susquehanna usually is good in Pennsylvania, not so much other states. And then we saw YouGov Rosen up by 7. Atlas Intel, which is a GOP leading pollster, they had, Rosen up by 5. So I don't believe this race is going to be too close, but I am moving it down out of an abundance of caution just because Brana has really coalesced the GOP base and because early voting in Nevada, Republicans have been turning out so far. So I don't think it's going to be a blowout as some of the polls in, August and September were indicating. But let's now go to Arizona. And as promised, we're going to talk about Kari Lake now. Kari Lake, I think, has been a very bad candidate for the GOP in terms of electability. She's really, I think, cost them what could have been a very winnable Senate race. Now, the good news for them is that she is gaining. She was down by 7 points. She's now only down by 4. And she's closed the gap at the final weeks. We've actually seen her leading in some of the latest polls, both from Atlas Intel. But at the same time, let's talk about why this is still bad for the GOP. So first of all, Kari Lake really blew a very winnable governorship in 2022. She was ahead by 2.5% on election day in the polls. She was favored to win by almost everybody, and she lost by 0.6 to Katie Hobbs, who's now the governor of Arizona, obviously. And Kari Lake really hurt herself because after that election, she said it was rigged. She spread baseless conspiracy theories, and that hurt her because the majority of voters in Arizona don't like that, right? And so now she's running for Senate, and these issues have come up again. Obviously, as you might predict, Ruben Gallego has been attacking her for all of this, and that is hurting her with moderate voters. Arizona is a very moderate state, and most importantly, I think Democrats have been on a winning streak here. In 2022, they won the Senate race by 5 points. Joe Biden won the presidency here in 2020 narrowly. Kamala Harris, I'm not going to reveal my prediction for Arizona at the presidential level. It's going to be close. Kamala Harris could win it. Donald Trump could win it. But either way, Lake in the polls is currently, she's down by 4. And Trump right now in Arizona is up by 3. So she's running 6-7 points behind him in the polls. And what that means is that for her to win here, Trump's going to have to win Arizona by a lot more than anyone expects. And I'm just not betting on that for now. And I think another important thing to note here is that Gallego polls significantly better than Kamala Harris with Hispanic voters. I think that could be another big factor, is even if Trump wins Arizona off the back of improvements with Hispanic voters, that might not be enough to save Kari Lake in the Senate race. But let's now go to the Rust Belt. Michigan is going to be our next state here. In Michigan, I'm feeling more confident about Democrats here. Again, the final week I think has been very kind to them in Michigan. We've actually seen Slotkin's polling lead expand a little bit. It's up, a couple tenths of percentage points from where it was a few weeks ago. And what we've seen is that if it lets me pull this all the way forward, hold on, actually maybe not. It's not letting me. But anyways, Slotkin right now is up by 4. And what we've seen is that, as I was saying, the highest quality pollsters show her ahead. And what's telling is that Trafalgar, which had Trump winning the state in 2020, they only have a tie here. This is, again, a GOP-aligned poll. New York Times has Slotkin up by 2. Mitchell has her up by 2, and they actually had her tied earlier on Message, which is a GOP pack, still Slotkin up by 1. YouGov, bit of an outlier here. They have Slotkin up by 9, but that's still a good poll for her. And then Marist, I'm a big fan of Marist, as you well know. They're very good in the Rust Belt. They have Slotkin up by 6 when they push undecided voters. So to me, again, we've gotten a few internal polls from Republicans showing them ahead, but it's pretty clear overall what the picture is. Republicans need a pretty clear polling miss. And actually today, the CEO of Mitchell Communications came out and said that he thinks polls are underestimating Democrats are undersampling Democrats, especially black Democrats from Detroit. That could mean that the polls aren't really going to be off Michigan by all that much the way they were in 2020. And Democrats, again, they've been on a winning streak here. They haven't won a statewide race here since 2016. Obviously, Donald Trump can win Michigan, but in the polls, he usually runs 2% ahead of Mike Rogers. Do we think Rogers is going to come within, or do we think Trump's going to win Michigan by more than 2 if he even does win it? I don't think so. Slotkin is the favorite to me at this point. I'm locking that in, that she does have an edge over Mike Rogers. Now, the final state, this is going to surprise some people, but I'm going to put Pennsylvania in the lean D column. I know a lot of people have moved it to toss-up. I'm still somewhat bullish on Bob Casey here, and let's talk about it. So, obviously, the polls have narrowed, and Casey's only up to about a 3-point lead. But again, when we look at the polls that are kind of coming in here, Trafalgar, Patriot, Insider Advantage, Atlas Intel, these are all GOP firms, the last 4. Atlas Intel, again, On Message, again, these are 2 GOP firms. And then obviously Echelon's another GOP-aligned firm. And they are, I think really skewing this average. If we look at the nonpartisan polls, right, New York Times, Siena, they still have Casey up by 5. This is an A-rated pollster. YouGov has Casey up by 6. Morning Consult has him up by 3. Suffolk has him up by 4. Eulenberg, which is a good local pollster, and I'm a big fan of local pollsters, they have Casey up by 3. So then, the nonpartisan polls that are most reputable, they still show Casey maintaining that advantage. He's an incumbent. Again, in 2018, he won by 12% over, or 13% over Lou Barletta. It's going to be closer than that, certainly. This time around, David McCormick's run a good campaign. I think Republicans be very happy with how they're doing here, given how popular Casey's been historically. But again, Pennsylvania, the delta between McCormick and Trump is concerning for Republicans. McCormick, again, tends to run 2 to 3 points behind Trump on average. Do we think Trump's going to win Pennsylvania by 2.5? I don't think so. I think he could certainly win it. Again, stay tuned for tomorrow's prediction. But by 3, by 2.5, that might be a bit of a tall order. So McCormick has run a good campaign. I think he's coming closer than a lot of people would have expected a few months ago. But Bob Casey, the incumbent who leads in the majority of nonpartisan polls, coupled with the fact that Democrats have built up a decent-sized early vote advantage, obviously the firewall is about 400,000 voters, not counting independent voters, right? So just 400,000 Democrats versus Republicans in that early vote share. I think the firewall could be bigger for Democrats. A lot of it's going to come down to a Republican turnout tomorrow on Election Day, but it's certainly not a disaster. And I think that at this point, if I were going to pick against Bob Casey, it would have to be, there'd have to be some more warning signs against Democrats at this point. So what does that mean? Democrats at 47. But Republicans, this is where it's going to get interesting. I'm going to give Republicans, first of all, Montana. So that means that if Donald Trump wins the presidency, Republicans have won the Senate majority right now, because that means that if Trump wins the presidency, J.D. Vance is breaking the tie, and so it's going to be 50-50 with Republicans breaking the tie. Now, if Harris wins the presidency, Republicans haven't won the majority just yet. But let's talk about Montana. Now, Montana, a lot of people I think are very bearish on Tester and think he's going to lose by 8 or 9 points. I think it's going to be closer to 5. Right now, the polls have it as about a 5-point lead for Tim Sheehy. And what we've seen is that, the consensus has become that Sheehy's ahead. The good pollsters, Emerson has Sheehy only up by 3, which is actually, I think, Tester's best poll in months. But again, if we take a look at the other pollsters, New York Times Siena has Sheehy up by 8, RMG has Sheehy up by 7, and they actually had Tester up, back in August. So, I do wish we had more polls here, but the fact of the matter is the few good pollsters we have do show Tester down. And again, he's an incumbent. He's only at 44%. No reason to think that undecideds are going to break massively for him in a red state like Montana. This is all just, to me to say that Democrats, that run of holding the seat's going to come to an end. Again, in 2018, Tester did hold on by around 4% or 3.5% against Matt Rosendale, but he's a strong candidate than Rosendale. Again, 2018 was a blue wave, and Tester won by 3.5 in a D plus 8 year. So obviously, he still underperformed national partisanship by a couple of points. And most importantly, again, Jon Tester is going to have to win on the same ballot as Donald Trump. Donald Trump's going to win Montana by, I think, 15 points, right? Tester, can he overcome a 15-point ticket split? I don't think, in this day and age with polarization so rampant and, essentially the decline of ticket splitting, do we think it's going to happen? I don't think so. If Montana were 5 or 6 points bluer, I could see it. If it were this is why, by the way, Ohio's going to be very close, and I don't think Montana's going to be that close. It's because Ohio was 7% bluer, or was 6% bluer than Montana in 2020. So it comes down to presidential partisanship. Tester can outperform. I think he's going to do well compared to Harris, but it's not going to be enough to win a state like Montana, which has become increasingly red. Now, let's go to Texas. I'm going to give this one to Ted Cruz. Now, in the final days of the campaign, there's been a lot of momentum for Democrats in Texas. I think that's undeniable. However, what I will say is that right now, I think there's a pretty clear ceiling. Colin Allred can get to 48%, but I don't think he can get more than that, and that's why I'm going to pick Ted Cruz here. Now, the good news for him is that he's been gaining in the polls, and a lot of good pollsters, they show it as a close race. What we saw was that he dropped an internal that had him tied here. We actually did get a morning consult poll. Let's see if I can find it. We got, he has led a nonpartisan poll, although it's only been one all cycle. The majority of, the other polls have Cruz ahead. But again, we've seen close polls. Signal, GOP aligned firm, they only have Cruz up by 4. NYT Siena, they have it as a 4-point race as well. And Emerson has it as a 2-point race. So again, there are signs this is going to be close. But at the end of the day, Texas is a red state. Long term, I think Democrats have a chance to make things interesting here. But this is a red state. Let's talk more specifically about this race, though. Ted Cruz in 2018, he only won by around, I think, 2%. Yeah, he won by 1.6% against Beto O'Rourke. And this was a race the Democrats kind of hoped they had momentum in the closing hours of the campaign. They ended up coming close to winning, but they lost. But again, this was a blue wave year. Democrats won the national popular vote by over 8% this year. Democrats had broadly a very good night in the House. And in Texas, they had a turnout advantage, and they still lost by 1.5 points. This is a fine showing by Beto O'Rourke. I'm not discounting what he did here, but this was about as good of a situation the Democrats could be in 2024, even if Kamala Harris does win the presidency, which, again, for the fifth time, I'll talk about tomorrow, or maybe later today. Who knows? So subscribe. But whether or not she wins the presidency, I don't think it's going to be as blue of a year as 2018. I think that's commonly understood. And so because of that, Democrats will likely not have a big turnout advantage the way they did in 2018, which would allow this race to narrow up a little bit. Ted Cruz is going to turn out, or really Trump's going to turn out Republican voters, and they're going to vote for Cruz, obviously, down the ballot. And that's going to be enough for him to hold on. Even though Colin Allred, I think, his run a good campaign is really, I think, caught up in the final months of this, of this race. So with that, we've got two more states. I'm going to be starting out in Wisconsin, where I do believe Tammy Baldwin has an edge, but a very small one. It's going to be in the tilt column. And again, why? So unlike in Michigan or Pennsylvania, I do buy that Republicans have legitimately closed the gap in a meaningful way. Eric Hovde's down to a 2-point deficit in this state. And again, Wisconsin polling misses have been very bad in presidential years. In 2016, they underestimated Trump by 8. 2020, they underestimated him by 7. And this year, obviously, I think the polling miss will be smaller, but who's to say that it won't exist? And that's going to benefit Republicans if it does come to fruition. Now, what we've seen is that some polls have actually found Hovde ahead. Insider Advantage and Trafalgar both have him leading by 1. But again, to be fair to Baldwin, I think the nonpartisan pollsters are of higher quality have had her ahead. NYT Siena only has her up by 4, though, which is a decrease from their previous polling. We saw Marist had her up by 3. CNN had her up by 2. So, again, the consensus among the best pollsters is that it's a narrow advantage for Baldwin. But given the fact that Wisconsin, because of that polling miss, that makes me skeptical. I do think Hovde has a path here. And Donald Trump certainly is going to be in a very close race in Wisconsin against Kamala Harris, right? But to me, the best thing for Republicans in the Senate race specifically is that the gap between Baldwin and Harris has rapidly closed. If you go back to the polls from September, Baldwin was running 5, 6, 7 points ahead of Harris. That meant that if you believe the Delta, Trump was going to have to win Wisconsin by 6 for Hovde to win. Now, it's like a 1-point gap. Right now, if we take a look at the polling average in the Senate race, Baldwin's up by 1, or Baldwin's up by 2. The presidential race, Harris is up by 1. So it's now a 1-point gap. What that means is that the amount that Trump needs to win Wisconsin by to drag Hovde over the finish line is a lot smaller. And so for that reason, I do expect, I think this race could legitimately close, and it could, be a real flip. Now, I'm picking Baldwin because she's an incumbent, and in 2018 she did very well. She won by 11 points. Again, if we go here, she won by 11. And in 2022, Democrats probably did pretty well in Wisconsin. They did, of course, lose the Senate race, but they were outspent massively. They gave up on this race in September, and they only lost by 1, which is a lot less than the polls had. They were supposed to lose by 4 or 5. So certainly Democrats have outperformed in Wisconsin a few cycles in a row. We've also seen the early vote. Obviously, Republicans have been showing up in the WOW counties, but in Madison, in Milwaukee, Democrats are showing up more than the state average, right? And of course, on election day, I do expect Democrats to get good turnout out of Madison because they've been doing that for the past 2 or 3 cycles. So Tammy Baldwin, I do think, has the advantage here, although it is closer than I think it would have been, 2 months ago. So the final race, Ohio. This race is unbelievably close. I've gone back and forth on it. Again, what I do for these competitive races is I get out my notebook and I draw a T-chart and I evaluate the advantages each side has, and then I weigh it at the end. And I spent 20 minutes on this one, right? Obviously, I've thought a lot about this race over the course of the cycle, and I spent a lot of time on this. Genuinely, I did. So what I'm going to do before I present my prediction on Ohio is I'm going to talk about the pros for Brown and the pros for Moreno. Brown, what does he have? He is the incumbent. He's done well before. In 2018, he won by 7 points on the same ballot as Mike DeWine winning the governorship by 4. He's an outperformer, and in the polls, he still leads. Republicans have gone all in on Ohio in the final month. What they've done is they've said, look, Moreno, we're going to really invest in you at the expense of Sam Brown in Nevada and Kari Lake in Arizona, who they've essentially given up on. They poured it all into Ohio, but in the majority of polls, we still see Sherrod Brown has an advantage. Now, here's what I will say, and this is important. That advantage is small. It's certainly not insurmountable. I'll talk more about that later. But Sherrod Brown still has an advantage in the polling data. Now, the last thing I want to say is that Seltzer poll. I haven't brought it up yet today, but it's relevant now. That Seltzer poll in 2016, it had Trump up by 7. It kind of foreshadowed what was about to happen in the Midwest with the Clinton collapse there. 2020, similar thing. It had Trump up by 7. Biden did better in the Midwest than Hillary Clinton, but not by more than 2 or 3 points per state. And so what does that mean? Seltzer is 2 for 2 in predicting how the Midwest has moved. This time, they see it moving towards Kamala Harris, which is really interesting, again, because I think personally, I expected it to move towards Trump. Iowa's a right-trending state in the Midwest in general, especially like Ohio and Iowa, have moved towards Republicans in recent years. But if you believe Seltzer, if Seltzer's even close to being right, it is an automatic loss for Moreno. So Seltzer, I think, made this race so much harder to decide. Now, with that being said, there's some advantages that Moreno has. I think the first one is obviously presidential partisanship, like I talked about for John Tester. Montana is a state that's going to vote for Trump by 15 points. Tester can outperform that, but by 15, maybe not. Now, Ohio is bluer than Montana. Trump won it by 8 in 2020. I think he's going to win it by a similar amount again. And that's what it comes down to. To me, if Trump wins Ohio by 5 or 6, like Seltzer might have you think, Brown's going to win re-election. But if it's a 9 or 10 point race, I think I'd rather be Moreno. At the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to how much you think Trump's going to win the state by. But before I give my final prediction, I do want to talk about the polls because they are what made me decide this race ultimately in favor of Bernie Moreno. Now, why do I say that? Well, right now, Sherrod Brown's only up by 1.2%. And his average right now, he's at 47.4 as an incumbent. That's not very high. Again, as an incumbent in the final days of the campaign, you want to be 49 or 50, even if you're in a competitive race. Brown is at 47. We've got a lot of undecided voters in this race. They're going to vote for Trump. I think they're going to vote Republican down the ticket and vote for Bernie Moreno. These polarized times, ticket splitting has really fallen off in the past few years, and that hurts. That's going to hurt Sherrod Brown. One more thing I want to note about 2018, even though he did win by 7 this year, comes with a big asterisk. Republicans, they left. They gave up on this race in August. They kind of left Jim Renacci to fend for himself. And that, I think, really helped Brown to inflate his margin of victory. It could have been close had Republicans actually tried to win here. So, at the end of the day, I'm going to pick Moreno. This is, I think, the race I feel the least confident about by far. The Seltzer poll really gave me a lot of pause on this because if it's even remotely accurate, Brown will win. I will be completely honest that, again, if Seltzer's remotely accurate, Democrats should hold this Senate seat. But the fact that Brown's only at 47.4 in the polls is just too much for me to ignore. And again, we've seen movement towards Moreno, right? As Republicans have invested more, we've seen movement towards Moreno. Morning Consult came out today and had him up by 1. We've seen other polls have Moreno ahead. Now, the good news for Brown is that we do have some high quality pollsters like Akron, like Miami. They've had him ahead. Obviously, the final WAPO poll had him up, but none of these polls have him, at 50%, and that's ultimately why I came down in favor of Bernie Moreno. So, that is the final Senate prediction. Wisconsin and Ohio are going to be razor tight, but that's the map. Democrats 48, Republicans 42. Republicans winning back the majority, although I think they could have done a lot better. This is certainly a map that was very advantageous for them, and I think they certainly could have done better at the end of the day. But they got the job done. They win the Senate. They flip Ohio, West Virginia, and Montana. They hold on to Texas, and that's going to be enough for them. So I'm going to show you the final margins in these competitive races. Again, you can screenshot these and come back to them later this week. I think with the exception of Ohio, I feel pretty confident about all of these, but certainly I've been thrown for loops before. For context, in 2022, I was right in all but one Senate race. I had John Fetterman losing, and he ended up winning actually by a pretty good amount. But overall, my map was good. I had the margins pretty good as well. So I feel good about this map, and I do expect to get comments on this video in a few days from now, and we'll see. So, again, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Please like this video. Please, it really does help me out so much. And again, later today or tomorrow, I'll be releasing the final presidential predictions, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you then.